He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
McEnroe was just too much of a handful. He was playing his best tennis of his career in 83 and 84. And even though I went into that final supremely confident with the way I was playing, he was just too good.
Hi, I'm Jesse Mulligan and this is Sports History NZ. My guest in this episode made it all the way to the final of Wimbledon, despite being unseeded. And there he met the most famous and fearsome man in world tennis, John McEnroe. Chris Lewis joined me in March 2022 to remember that special tournament almost 40 years later. But first, I wanted to know how life was now, running a tennis school in California.
California life is very busy, and unlike what you hear a lot of the time about California is that it's a very laid-back place. The opposite is true. It is just nonstop.
Tell me about Irvine.
Irvine is where we have our academy, namely at the Great Park, which is a multi-sport facility. In fact, it's the biggest of its type in the US, where there's a number of sports, obviously, tennis being one of them. And we run 25 courts with our programs, which cater to all ages and all levels of ability. And we've got a second venue in Woodbridge, which is a residents association, 30,000 people strong, the biggest of its type in California, I believe, maybe the US. But between the two of them, it keeps us really busy, Jesse.
It sounds pretty cool, and I guess that it's a pretty good way of ending arguments when you tell them, well, I was a finalist at Wimbledon in 1983. Must give you a heck of a lot of cred.
It certainly does give you credibility, and in an environment such as Southern California, which is a tennis hub, there is definitely plenty of competition, but having performed on the Pro Tour and having had experience being coached by such iconic, legendary coaches such as Harry Hopman and Tony Roach, and then myself coaching Ivan Lendl and Carl-Uwe Stieb, who was the number 2 player in Germany, it tends to give us a bit of a seat in the front row or first in line. So it definitely helps, Jesse.
Great. I didn't realise that you were the junior Wimbledon champion 8 years earlier in 1975. Can you tell us a bit about that moment?
Certainly. Well, Junior Wimbledon was the pinnacle of my junior career. I was seeded number 1, and I had actually competed the previous year in 1974 and lost in the quarterfinals. And going into Junior Wimbledon in 1975, the year I won it, I'd actually won every junior match that I'd played that year. I was unbeaten, and subsequently I was ranked top seed for the tournament. So I felt as though I had certainly a very good chance of winning the event, which ended up happening. But one of the outcomes of winning it was I played an Ecuadorian player in the final, Ricardo Icaza, who was a protege of Harry Hopman, about whom I just spoke. And after the match, Mr. Hopman came up to me, introduced himself, not that he needed any introduction, and invited me to his academy. So that then became my base for my pro career and springboarded me into the pro ranks. So as a result of winning Junior Wimbledon, I got invited into the US indoor circuit and ended up, as I said, having that invitation from Mr. Hopman to attend his academy in Florida.
Yeah, speaking of indoor, I know some players tend to prefer certain surfaces. Was grass your preferred surface?
Definitely. And the reason for that was I grew up playing on it. New Zealand was one of the countries that was predominantly grass courts, and I played 6 months of the year on grass. So I certainly had a good developmental background in grass court tennis. The Europeans didn't, so it certainly was very helpful. On the other hand, I ended up very much liking clay, which was something that was foreign to me until the age of about 16 or 17, and ended up liking that probably as my second preferred surface.
Can you tell us a bit about how you got into tennis?
Certainly. My parents had a love for the game, and that's actually how they met. As a result of the love for the game, they always made sure that we lived next door to tennis courts. And the first courts that I lived by was the Lower Hutt Tennis Club when I was 5, 6 years old. And like a number of kids in the street, it was a small street, but we would congregate at the Lower Hutt Tennis Club after school, spend our weekends there. So because of my parents' love of the sport and because we lived in the neighborhood right next to a tennis court, next to a tennis club, that's how I got my initial intro into the sport, Jesse.
And Was there pressure to become a tennis player? I note that your brothers both became serious tennis players as well. Did you feel the weight of expectation from your parents?
No, just the opposite. My parents were very sensitive to putting any extra pressure on us. So I would say they went to great lengths to take pressure off us. For example, when they would watch us play, there was never any postmortems. There was never any, you should have done this or you should have done that, or any sort of criticism, any sort of negativity. It was all along the lines of, we just love watching you play and we hope you enjoyed it. Win or lose, that was the attitude. So I couldn't have asked for any more from mum and dad.
I happen to be reading a book set in a tennis academy at the moment, Chris, and life sounds pretty bleak for young, very talented players. This is a fictional book, of course, but did you manage to keep the fun in the game as you grew up and became really serious about it?
100%. And I think that's one of the essential characteristics of having a career, no matter what it is. You've got to have a passion for it. And I can honestly say to this day, Jesse, I still have a passion for the game. The only difference is that when I was playing professionally, I was playing for myself. Now in the coaching realm, I'm advising and coaching and developing young players and treating them hopefully the way I would like to be treated myself. So underneath all that, what gives rise to all of that is a passion. It has been a lifelong passion for the sport.
Is it possible to sum up what you love about tennis?
Well, initially, I grew up playing rugby as well. So I was involved in my school team. I played for Linfield College, and it was a team sport, obviously, in contrast to tennis, which is a uniquely individual sport. And as a teenager, even though I loved rugby, I tended towards the individualistic nature of tennis because it was me it was totally self-reliant on how I did. It wasn't having to rely on team members. It wasn't suffering the disappointment of somebody in the team maybe making a mistake at the end of a game that cost you the match. With tennis, it's you against your opponent, and that's it. And that appealed to me. So I think that was just the nature of competition. The individualistic nature of it that tennis lends itself to, I think fundamentally, and then also the sophistication of the game. It's a very, very chess-like game on a tennis court where you're having to outthink and outmaneuver your opponent who's trying to do the same to you. So I think it had very much a sort of a cerebral challenging effect as well, where it required a lot of thinking, not just in outsmarting or outthinking an opponent, but also building one's game. It takes a lot of skill. I'd say along with golf, tennis and golf are the two sports individually that demand the most skill from its proponents or its players.
As you progressed as a young player, how would you characterize your own game? Were you a baseline player? Would you like to get to the net? Were you an all-rounder? Can you give us a bit of an insight?
No, I was a serve volleyer pretty much exclusively, except for when I played on particularly slow courts like clay. But I would say I would definitely define myself as a serve and volleyer. These days, there's really only four types of players. There's the all-court player, a la Federer. There's a serve volleyer, like the last really high-level serve volleys, sort of Pete Sampras and Pat Rafter. And then you've got your aggressive baseliners and you've got your defensive baseliners. That's it. I was certainly in the serve volley category.
Okay. So let's take a look at those heady days of the 1980s, early 80s. And before we get to Wimbledon in 1983, there's the Davis Cup in 1982, which actually probably your achievements a year later eclipsed that. But that was a pretty big deal to get New Zealand to the semi-finals in what was a truly international competition, and one where countries put their best players forward, right?
Without a doubt, Jesse. New Zealand's performance in the Davis Cup prior to, I'm thinking 1920-something, where New Zealand actually competed as part of an Australasian team and were tremendously successful, and Anthony Wilding was an integral part of that team. But subsequent to that, I think it was 1924, New Zealand played as an individual country, and that result in 1982, New Zealand's semi-final performance, That was the best result that New Zealand had achieved as an individual sovereign nation. And to be part of that was obviously incredibly fulfilling. And I was still am incredibly proud today for that performance, the magic years.
Who were some of your teammates and your coach?
There was Russell Simpson, Jeff Simpson, Oni Parran, and we had as our coach Jeff Robson, who was he was the captain, and the coach that year was Tony Roach, an Australian great who himself was a product of Harry Hopman. And that's when I first got to know Tony. And subsequent to that Davis Cup involvement, I was so impressed with the expertise and the mastery that he had over the game and the advice that he was able to pass on, that he was hugely instrumental in that semi-final result that year. And we only lost to France 3-2 in the semi-finals. And as a result of that association with Tony, because of the Davis Cup, he went on to coach me for the next 2 or 3 years. And I got to say that without a doubt, we would not have got to the semis of the Davis Cup without Tony's involvement, and I would have not made a final of Wimbledon without his input.
And I guess you would have got to rub shoulders with some of your heroes and some of the most famous and talented players in the world.
On that note, I can certainly tell you a story. When Mr. Hopman invited me to his academy, and bear in mind that Mr. Hopman was responsible for the development of legendary players like Rod Laver, Lou Hode, John Newcombe, Tony Roach, Roy Emerson, just that golden era of Australian tennis. Mr. Hopman, he was at the forefront of that. He spearheaded it. And then when I went to his academy, as a tribute to his greatness, a lot of those former greats, like Laver, like Lou Hode, they would come and visit him. And Mr. Hopman would invite us being players like Paul McNamee and Peter McNamara and myself, to the dinner table so that we could sit and listen to the stories about their exploits when they were former number ones in the world. And it was just incredible to be a party to that. Can you imagine, say, 20 years or 30, 20 years, 25 years from now, you've got a young junior growing up idolizing players like Federer and Nadal, and then 20 years later, here he is sitting at the dinner table with them listening to what happened in a particular Wimbledon final. It was the equivalent of that. And
I notice you still call him Mr. Hopman. Was he that sort of guy?
He actually was, and he had commanded so much respect, and I saw McEnroe would come down, for example, and train at the academy and would call him Mr. Hopman. Occasionally, Vitas Gerulaitis, who was a real character, would call him Mr. H, but that's about as far as anybody would take it. Nobody called him anything other than Mr. Hopman. That was it. And still to this day, I feel uncomfortable calling him anything else but Mr. Hopman.
I love that. I'm talking to Chris Lewis in our New Zealand Sporting Memories segment, and obviously now we come to 1983 at Wimbledon. And actually, your lead up to Wimbledon wasn't that auspicious, Chris. Is that fair to say?
More than fair to say. It was very inauspicious. I played probably the worst tennis that I'd played in my pro career in the early stages of 1983. But ironically, I think that was the impetus to really get things going again, because I just realized this is not the sort of career that I was aspiring to. And I think it triggered a very positive response in me. And I just said, I've had enough of this. I don't want to be holding down a job. This is still a career to me. And I was motivated by the fact that it was a very poor few months.
You even had a bit of sickness, right?
I did. I actually got food poisoning at the French, was sort of the icing on the cake. And it gave me time to reflect about what I wanted the future to look like. After the French, I started spending a ton of time on the practice court getting ready for Wimbledon. And Jeff Simpson, I got to mention Jeff, former New Zealand Davis Cup player, was very instrumental in that preparation. We were on court for the majority of the day. We'd hit the running track. He would do the running with me. And he had extraordinary input as far as the build-up for Wimbledon went in 1983. That, I was hugely in debt to Jeff as well.
You entered as an unseeded player. Can you explain to people what that means?
Unseeded means, what seeding is, it is an assurance that the top players or the favorites don't meet each other in the early rounds of a tournament. For example, whoever's ranked number one in the world traditionally will be seeded number one at Wimbledon and will go at the top of the draw. There's 128 players in the draw. And let's say Nadal is ranked one and Djokovic is ranked two, vice versa. They will go at the top in the bottom of the draw so that the only place that they could meet if they both win all their matches would be in the final. So it's to try and ensure that the top players don't knock each other out in the early rounds. So there used to be 16 seeds at Wimbledon. I believe there are now 32 out of the 128. When I was playing, there were 16 seeds. So in theory, you have the top 16 players in the world seeded 1 through 16, and then everybody else, it's the luck of the draw where you're placed.
Okay. Fair to say the unseeded players aren't expected to get to the final?
No, that's true. And, the favorites, if you look at Wimbledon, you always look at the top 2 or 3 seeds. They're going to be the favorites. So if you've got McEnroe playing, who was the top seed that year, I believe, and Lendl were the top seeded guys, Jimmy Connors. It might have been Connors that was number 2 that year. But, yeah, they were clearly the favorites based on their track record over the previous 12 months.
In fact, you were the 7th unseeded man in history to reach the Wimbledon singles final.
Well, there you go. And given that Wimbledon had probably been going for a good on 100 years at that time, 7 out of 100, it's not a huge percentage.
You had to win how many games to get to the final?
So in 128 draw, to make the final, you've got to win 6 matches, and then the final is the 7th match.
Okay. How did you go in those early matches? Did you feel like this might be your tournament?
I certainly did. I played a gentleman called Steve Denton in the first round, an Australian player who was seeded, and tough grass courter. He was, I believe, he was certainly in the final of the Australian Open, lost to Johan Creek, and may have made the final twice. I'm not sure, but he really had a stellar grass court record and was a formidable opponent first round with a massive serve. But I felt as though I had a good chance against him because I had the sort of game that lent itself well to the big servers, and consistency wasn't his defining attribute, I would say. So being pretty quick around the court and being a guy that just made players play, it was a bit of a handful for Steve. I won in 5 sets. It was a very hard-fought match, but I think fitness also had a bit to do with it, and scraped through that match, and that couldn't have been a better start to the tournament, was to knock a seeded player out in the first round, a very highly regarded seeded player.
Awesome. Okay, tell us about a few of the other games.
Well, then after that, second round, I played a gentleman, Brock Dyke, Australian player, very competent grass court player. I played very, very well, and I won that one fairly comfortably. And then in the third round, I played Mike Bauer, who had a win over Connors at Palm Springs or Indian Wells earlier that year. Very, very competent. I was down against Mike. I played come from behind tennis. I won in a very long, drawn-out 5-set match, and once again, that was my third match. So having won 2 out of 3 extremely close 5-setters, then you start thinking, okay, this is my year. This is how this is. And funnily enough, when I got to the final, when I won Junior Wimbledon in 75, in the semifinals, I played Brad Jewett, who was a top Australian junior, and he had a couple of match points on me, and I came back from behind to win that match. Wow. And then also in an earlier round, I think it was quarterfinals, I played the top Swedish junior, who also had a pretty decent lead over me, and I came back to win that. So it was almost like paralleling what had happened the year I won Junior Wimbledon, but it was happening in the senior tournament. So I really felt as though this was going to be my year. And then in the fourth round, I played Nduka Odazor, who had knocked out Guillermo Vilas. I think Vilas, he was certainly one of the very highly ranked seeds, former number 2 in the world. And I had to play Odazor. And the interesting thing about that match is the winner was going to make it to the quarterfinals, which is a big deal. Getting to your first quarterfinal in a Grand Slam event is a major deal. Jesse, I didn't sleep that night. I had no sleep, just projecting about the match and the anxiety and the pressure. And, you'd think that it doesn't happen very often. It happens a lot in Davis Cup and big matches, not a wink of sleep. And my match was due to start early afternoon. Now, my routine to date had been practicing at 10 o'clock every morning for an hour at the Wimbledon practice courts. So I had to make the decision, do I try and get some sleep and forego practice, or do I practice and keep my routine having had no sleep? So I chose the latter. I practiced for an hour, as per my routine. And then I grabbed like a 30 or 45 minute sleep in the locker room in one of the cubicles that housed the bars, and got in 45 minutes sleep. I lost the first 3 points of the match. I was serving. I think Otisor hit 3 winners, and I thought, oh my gosh, hopefully this is not going to be affected by the lack of sleep. And I definitely felt tired. And then oddly enough, I went on to play as well as I could possibly play and beat him in 3 straight sets very handily, which was, it's hard to, project that can happen when you've gone a night without literally a wink's sleep. Now I'm in the quarterfinals.
And at that point, even, that would have been, the peak of your achievements as an individual player?
Yes, quarterfinals of a Grand Slam, that's major. So Ani Parrin had made the quarterfinals of Wimbledon before, and he had made the finals of the Australian Open. Just a great, great player. And now here I am in the quarterfinals, and I've done what Ani's done. So from a New Zealand perspective, certainly very, very significant. And from an international perspective, yes. Also, what was interesting was that support was starting to grow, particularly from New Zealand. I was flooded with telegrams. Probably a lot of the audience doesn't even know what telegrams are, but the locker room, I would turn up in the locker room, and the size of the lockers is pretty significant. There were 2 or 3 lockers full of telegrams that, as an aside, British Telecom let me know it was the most telegram support they had experienced in Wimbledon's history, which just shows you how much interest there is in the tournament. Now, in the quarterfinals, I'm playing Mel Purcell, an American player, and up and coming, my age, pretty much my age. And I thought that I had a very, very good chance of beating Mel. It ended up that I did beat him in 4 sets. It was pretty tight, hard-fought match, but went my way. And now here I am in the semifinals against Kevin Curran, who had beaten Jimmy Connors.
And I don't want to underplay the final, but was this the match of your life up against Kevin Curran?
Definitely. If somebody were to say to me, what was the most significant win that you had in your career? Undoubtedly, Jesse, it would be the match against Kevin in the semifinals of Wimbledon. So here you are. My match against Mel Purcell was on a stadium court, but it wasn't on the center court in the quarterfinals. It was on court 1, which is, it's a huge court, but it's not center. So here I am now playing on the world's tennis stage against Kevin Curran, who's beaten Jimmy Connors. And just to put it in context, the Wimbledon final at that stage was the 3rd most watched sporting event on the planet behind World Cup soccer, the Olympics and World Cup soccer. Now here I am playing 1 match away from being in the final of what in essence is the World Tennis Championships. Wimbledon is the highest status event on the calendar. There's no question. Now I'm playing Kevin Curran, who's beaten Connors. And the focus of the international sporting world is on this event. Prior to the match, it was McEnroe versus Lendl. So here, Kevin and I are following the McEnroe-Lendl match in the Royal Box as Margaret Thatcher. There's an audience of hundreds of millions of people. There's a live audience of 15 or 16,000 people. You walk out, and there's a room that you go into prior to walking out on the center court anytime you play on it, where you're with the player that you're going to play, and you're in there in silence, and you walk out on a center, and it's surreal. So here I am now playing on a Wimbledon center court, where is a 10-year-old back in Mount Albert, New Zealand, Auckland. I'm playing imaginary Wimbledon finals on the center court. Now here I am playing the real thing. So not only have I won Junior Wimbledon, now I'm 1 match away from being in the final of Wimbledon itself. And that feeling is indescribable when you walk out on the court, to the reaction to the crowd. You got the television cameras, you got the press lined up. It's just an extraordinary experience. And, it was 39 years ago. It seems like yesterday, Jesse.
Huh.
And then to play your best tennis on what was the biggest occasion that I'd experienced in my playing career, well, you couldn't really ask for any more, could you? And the feeling of winning that match was just pure and absolute elation. You're out there for 4 hours against an opponent that is one of the best grass courters in the world for a place in the final. and here you are coming out on top. And that last point, match point, when that went my way, and here's the reality of now of being in a Wimbledon final. It was just all the work, all the hours, all the dedication that had been put in. That's what makes life worthwhile, I can tell you. That feeling is just beyond belief.
Let's have a listen to that moment.
That is a cruel piece of luck. It really is, because that didn't bounce at all. So ace number 8 for Chris Lewis brings him at last to match point. He's done it.
Goosebumps again, Chris Lewis. You remember
absolutely,
that, eh?
Jesse. I get goosebumps now. I got them now.
How was the media reaction when you won?
The media reaction was massive, and you're in the press room, there's a press conference, and you're asked all these questions. And at the end of it, what I do remember, though, is that there was a personal call that was put in from the Prime Minister of the time, Rob Muldoon. So what I remember about that conversation was his parting words. I think one of the press people said to Rob Muldoon, "What advice do you have for Chris?" And he said, "Just to keep doing what he's been doing." Which, I can still hear those words today, and it was good advice. Unfortunately, McEnroe was just too much of a handful. He was playing his best tennis of his career in 83 and 84. And even though I went into that final supremely confident with the way I was playing, he was just too good.
Yeah, I've been so into this conversation. I haven't left us much time to talk about the final. Did you play your best game, though?
I didn't play my best, nowhere near it, but that was because he didn't let me. John was just too good. And if you look at the result in the following year's final against Jimmy Connors, he did exactly the same thing to Connors with an even easier score than against me. So to put it in context, had I won that match, you could possibly argue that it would have been the greatest upset in tennis history.
And happy memories of 1983 for you then, obviously.
More than happy. Even though there is the disappointment of losing the final, at a deeper level, the satisfaction was indescribable. I mean, here you are now in a Wimbledon final. Even though you've lost it, there is every little bit of effort, every last ounce that I was capable of was left on that court, I can tell you.
Wonderful. You coming back to New Zealand anytime soon?
I would love to. When things are a little more conducive to traveling freely and doing everything you like to do without having to worry about any other considerations, I would love to be back there.
Great. We'd love to have you. I know it's been a really tough a couple of years for your family for a number of reasons, Chris, and I wanted to express our sympathy around that and to say thanks so much for your time today and for giving so many New Zealanders such exciting, passionate, incredible memories of those days. Thanks for listening to this episode of Sports History NZ, and a special thanks to Chris Lewis for being my guest. Sports History NZ was produced by Melita Tull, Ayana Piper-Helian, Sally Ward and Sam Hollis. The podcast was put together by Justin Gregory. Tim Watkin is RNZ's executive producer of podcast and series. And there are plenty more amazing stories just like this one from our sporting past for you to follow and listen to. You can find them at Apple Podcasts, iHeart, Spotify, or wherever you found this podcast.